introduce our second speaker. Wilson White graduated from GSSM in 1999. He has he began his college career with a bachelor's in computer engineering from NCSU. Then he got his law degree from the University of North Carolina. So a very diverse individual, went from software engineer to a patent attorney, and that's how he started at Google. In 2011, he was the patent litigation counsel for Google, and then just a short time later, in 2013, was promoted to Senior Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy there at Google. He thrives on helping people and organizations solve their biggest challenges, and in fact, last year he was recognized for his outstanding work as the Governor's School for Science and Mathematics Outstanding Alum Award. He received that award last year, and so we just thank you for all of the work that you have done in the state and outside of South Carolina, and we welcome you to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Cherish, and thank you, Danny. Let me just say that Danny's presentation, all of those ideas and the amazing growth that you've seen from the Science and Math School, most of that is Danny's vision. So having someone who actually benefited from the school, was a student at the school, and has come back now to lead the school. As an alumnus, that's a very special thing for me, and it's really good to see a lot of Danny's his vision coming to life. So Danny, thank you for all you've done for the Science and Math School. I've been asked to give some brief remarks, and I'm emphasizing brief because I grew up here in rural South Carolina in the AME church. And I remember my pastor as a kid warning me about the perils of having the microphone in a captive audience. One of the things he told me then that has stuck with me throughout my entire career, and I do a lot of public speaking as part of my career, is the 5 B's. 5 B's. I was like, Pastor, what do you mean by 5 B's? Usually it's like the number 3, like 3 things that you remember. What's the 5 B's? And he said, it's very easy. You will always remember this. And he was right. The 5 B's are, be brief, brother, be brief. So I will try to implement that tonight so we can get back to discussing and socializing post this. But I wanted to talk a bit about, just very quickly, my path from the Science and Math School. Danny has done a great job of just highlighting the experience that young kids get by attending the school. And now we have kids who aren't necessarily moving to Hartsville and uprooting their families for 2 years. They're able to get that type of college quality education in remote settings, and that's been great. I was fortunate, Danny, I really do believe we lived in the same suite based on the picture you showed there. I was fortunate to spend 2 years in that residential program. And not only did Ms. Rutherford, as Danny referenced, fundamentally changed my approach to my academic life and life in general, but the experience of being with some of the most talented people, not just in our state here in South Carolina, but in the world, in such an integrated way really has informed what I've done since leaving the Science and Math School. As Cherish said, at the Science and Math School, I got introduced to computer science. In my high school in Andrews, South Carolina, we didn't have computers, so the idea that I could tell a computer what to do was a very challenging transition for me going to the Science and Math School, but I fell in love with that challenge and decided to go to college and pursue a career in computer engineering. Did that at NC State. I was talking to some of the guys earlier about NC State being the best football college, certainly in the ACC, but maybe across the board. I don't want to create any more enemies here. I think those guys are there. And then I started my career as a software developer at IBM because I wanted to actually put a lot of that academic work into practice. And for about the first 5 days of that, I loved it. And then the remaining months of that, I really, really thought about how can I actually take that academic training, the experience I had being a software engineer, and scaling that. Because part of what we learn at the Science and Math School is how do we actually solve big challenges? How do we actually grow food in places where the land is not fertile and won't allow for that, right? Really big challenges. And that's what I wanted to do with this academic background and the experience I've had being a software engineer. Fortunately, another aspect of that training from the Science and Math School was this notion that you need to have mentors. And my math professor at the Science and Math School, Ms. Rutherford, was a mentor of mine. So while I was at IBM, the mentor that I developed there was a patent lawyer. And I grew up in a family, we didn't have lawyers in my family. I didn't know what a patent lawyer was, but I learned through that mentorship that a patent lawyer is actually an engineer who's also a lawyer. You can be both. And that really opened my mind to that career. That's why I went to law school. I went to law school laser focused on being a patent lawyer, left law school, clerked for a federal judge, and then went to a big law firm to do patent litigation. And that's really what set the stage for me moving across country to a different country in some respects, to California to join Google. Started at Google as a patent lawyer, and while there, it was at the time. Have you guys heard the term patent troll? It's kind of, in some circles, it's kind of a derogatory term for non-practicing entities. But it was at the height of the smartphone wars, and patent litigation was just rampant. And that's why Google was trying to beef up its patent litigation resources. But while I was there, and I was killing trolls. That was kind of my mantra. I'm killing trolls, one troll at a time in court. It dawned on me that that's one way of solving that problem. Like every litigation, like just winning that for Google. Or we can really look at the root of the problem, which is the abuse of the patent litigation system, or the litigation system more broadly in the US. And so why not take that fight to a broader audience, right? So I led the fight for our company, and it's okay, changing the litigation rules. We called it patent reform in Congress at the time, and right, it's the same way of attacking the problem, but attacking it at scale. And that was my introduction to public policy and government affairs, and that's what I've been doing at Google since then. It's been a great experience working at a company that really has at its core mission solving some of the world's greatest challenges. In fact, our mission is to make all the world's information universally accessible and useful, like all the world's information. It sounds cliche, but if you talk to people at Google, like we actually believe that we can organize all the world's information and make that useful for people. And you see that's why we deploy our technologies kind of in that way. Another part of the experience I have in the role at Google is working with some of our venture arms. So Google Ventures and Capital G, our large stage, late stage investment arm, and advising our portfolio companies on how the work that they're doing and the technology that they're building, how that impacts societies around the world. And the government affairs background has been very helpful to me in that. And then in my leisure time, I actually serve as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, another ACC school, in their technology entrepreneurship program, helping founders and startups navigate the legal aspects of getting a company off the ground and scaling the company. So it's been a great almost 20 years being rooted in technology from different perspectives, as a technologist, as a lawyer, and as someone who's working with governments around the world in creating policies that help innovation continue to grow. I wanted to talk about a few things that we're doing at Google that I think has been inspiring for me, but also I think very important for founders and startup folks who are, some of you will be pitching your ventures to folks here this week. And the first is the power of technology itself. I was telling someone earlier during the reception that it's so good to have like an in-person event and to be able to be around people, to see people and touch and feel people. We haven't had that for 18 months, given the pandemic. And yes, the pandemic has been tough. The financial disaster, economic disaster, the amount of lives that we've lost. I mean, it's been a really tough road. But the pandemic has also highlighted a few things for us, right? The things that matter to us, our families, being connected to each other, and the power of technology. If it wasn't for technology, even though I have 3 small kids and it was a crazy time, they were able to have some form of education at home. That's because of technology. Technology has allowed us to solve these challenges in the moments of crisis. And that's a reminder to us that like technology really is a vehicle for how we will solve problems in the future. Some of the areas that we're thinking about at Google where there are big challenges for us as a society are areas of sustainability. How do we actually tackle what will be a challenge for a global society in the years to come? And there's a lot of green space for there, and there's a lot of people doing some hard thinking there. In fact, I met, was it Debbie? Yeah. Earlier, who's working with a company that's really thinking about how we do some cool things in the renewable space. So very, very exciting stuff. You should chat with her about that. But also, how do we leverage emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics to actually solve some existing challenges that have been vexing for us for a very long time? How do we get energy consumption down? How do we get safe food in the homes of people? How do we house people? These issues that we've been wrestling with as a global society for years, how do we now actually use these technologies to do that? I was talking to Jennifer earlier about in the real estate industry, and this is an industry like that's been around forever. We've all known the pain points in buying a home or finding the land that you need for a project that you want to get off the ground. We've known these problems and these pain points for years, but now how can we leverage technology like AI to actually do some of the work there? And I know Jennifer's at a company now that's doing some hard thinking there. So what we've tried to do at Google is attack these issues from several vectors. One, ourselves, right? We're a big company. We've been very fortunate to be a very successful company. So we can do things like make investments in crazy ideas that are 10x thinking, like trying to solve super, super, super complicated problems. And we do that with some of our areas like Google X, where we're doing what we call moonshots, solving really, really, really big challenges. But we also do it from an investment standpoint, where we invest in companies like some of the companies that are represented here through our early stage venture arm, Google Ventures, or if you're fortunate and you're later in that stage with Capital G, which is our late stage investment arm. But not only that, but we recognize that our technology shouldn't be something that we hoard, right? Like we make our technology accessible. It's kind of our mission. So a lot of our technologies are open source technologies. So if you're building a mobile app, you can build on Android, largely for free. Or if you're using AI, we have open APIs for our AI technology. TensorFlow is the brand that we use for that. So that's another way that we're trying to help scale this work. And then finally, accelerators, where we actually bring developers and startup founders and small businesses and introduce them to our tools so that they can learn how these tools can actually be implemented in their businesses and to scale their businesses. That doesn't necessarily scale Google's business, is a way to scale the application of technology. And that's another area that we invest in pretty heavily. The final thing I want to talk about before opening it up to questions is I'm technically off today, but I love my job so much that I got to do a little bit of work while I'm here. And so what I do now at Google is government affairs and public policy. I travel around the world talking to government stakeholders, civil society, and other influencers who are in the policy-making conversation. And in fact, in the US, in the past 6 months, I've testified at the US Senate in 2 hearings on technology. So a very interesting job. I love the job. One thing that worries me about what I see in the job that I have is that in those policy conversations, the big companies, like the company I work for, we're in those conversations. But a lot of what's being discussed and a lot of the policy making that's being done will have a major impact on startups and small and medium-sized businesses, and they're just not in the conversation. And so part of what I want to do with this part of my talk tonight is for those of you who are startup founders or are running small businesses, get into those policy conversations. Because a lot of what policymakers are trying to solve for, right? They are basically refereeing a fight between the super big companies, the trillion-dollar companies, and the multi-billion-dollar companies, right? Like that's what policymakers are refereeing because that's who they're hearing from. But they need to hear from the businesses who need policymakers and good policymaking the most. So I encourage you to do that. I think I'm now at the 5th B, so I will stop there and open it up for questions. Thank you for inviting me back to my home state, and I love talking to you.
Yeah, where do you see development in technology going in the next 5 years as far as applications?
Yeah, good question. So for those of you who didn't hear it, the question was where do I see like the technology evolving over the next 5 years or so, applications, et cetera. I think a backdrop to that I'll say is that most of this will be powered by the internet. The internet is only like 25, 30 years old. It's still early days for the internet, although we've seen so much growth, so much benefit from the internet. I think we're going to see the next generation of what the internet can do in the years ahead. Where I see most of the investment now is really in the application of technologies like AI for problems that we've seen. AI, robotics, quantum computing, and applying that in familiar areas. I think I see that's where the technology is evolving. For us, it's a lot about how do we help people get things done? So Google historically was a search company. You would go and you would have a query or a question and would give you a series of answers, and then you'd have to go figure out how to do it. Technology now is trying to be more assistive to people. Like how do we actually help people get things done in the moments that they're in? And I see that's where these applications of technology will go. Yes, Cherish.
You were saying that startups and smaller businesses need to get in the policy conversation. How do they do that? Or what is the easiest way to start down that road?
Yeah, good question. How do you get into the policy conversation if you're a small business? First of all, recognize that it's important to your business. Like if you're a small business, you're thinking, no, I got to get my first customer, I got to get my revenue numbers up, I got to build my technology, scale it. Absolutely yes to all of that, but you also need to be aware of what's happening in the policy conversation and injecting in that where it makes sense. And it can start very small with just knowing who your representatives are and what their positions are on issues that impact technology and innovation, not just the politics, right? Oftentimes, if you're a small business, you're like, those are politicians. They're doing political stuff. I'm running a business. But a lot of times, the policies around innovation are caught up in politics. So being aware of who your representatives are and what their positions are on things that impact innovation, writing a letter to your congressman or your senator or your state lawmaker, you can do those things because that letter from a small business owner is going to resonate much more than a letter from some big company like the company I work for. So being aware of their positions and engaging in that conversation. Yes, sir.
How important is it to get a patent or an idea before, I guess, you start working on an idea?
Good question. The question was, how important is it to get a patent on your idea before taking it to market? I'm a patent lawyer by training, so this is, I will say it's the utmost importance. I will tell you, as an IP lawyer, this is an area where many small businesses where they fail. You all hear the stats that early businesses, most of them fail, but this is an area that really trips up small businesses. And it's not just patents, it's other areas of intellectual property as well. Your trademarks. You may have materials that you're building that should be subject to copyright that you should try to protect. And it's these areas that if you get the right protection, you're also building more value to your company. You may never, I was talking to Bridget, who recently got a patent after 6 years of battling with the USPTO. Congratulations. But now that you have that patent, you may or may not continue to build a business around that patent, but that's an asset that you can still license and otherwise use. And so thinking very early on about how do I protect my intellectual property, whether it's an invention and you're doing it with patent, or whether it's the brand that you've built and you're doing that with other forms of IP like trademark and copyright. It's an important, it's the utmost importance in the early stages of your business.
My password is patented, so don't look at it.
I thought I saw one back here.
So you were talking about patent reform. How do you rank, or what are your comments on the quality of patent examiners in the U.S. versus in the EU?
Ooh, good question. Quality. They're all great. I have to work with all of them. They're all fun. I will say in the U.S., post-patent reform several years ago, it's gotten better in the U.S. because we've now created a new process whereby after a patent is granted, as opposed to fighting in court, you actually can have the patent re-reviewed at the patent office. And we've created a structure around having patent judges. So these are people who have to be like Danny, very deep, like multiple degrees in engineering, very smart, technical people who are able to actually ensure that if we're going to give you a monopoly on this technology for a number of years, it really is something that is innovative. So I think the quality of our examiners as well as the review process has gotten better in the US. Europe doesn't have an equivalent process yet, but that's probably something that will evolve over time. Yeah.
What advice would you give to small businesses on how to work with large organizations like Google?
Good question. Advice on how, if you're a small organization, how to work with these big enterprises like Google. First, I think events like this where you're able to network, meet people, and engage with them. I do a lot of events like this. I meet a lot of people who would love to have like some connection with Google. One thing to keep in mind is that a company like Google is humongous. There's so much that's going on there. There's probably something happening at the company that could be useful to you at whatever stage you are in your venture. And the onus should be on you to think about like what you actually need. So when you're interacting with a representative from the company, you can really be very specific about where you are, what you're asking, so that person can help navigate the internal morass that exists there. So that's one piece of advice. Really think about what do I actually need and how can this company be helpful to me, or what's the right person I want to meet, or the right resource. So you're asking somewhat specific questions. And then the other thing I would say is to be persistent. It's a huge company with a lot going on. Folks are super busy, but the people that work there are really good people, and we're all driven by helping others succeed. And that's why I stayed at the company for 10 years, because these are really good people that are there. So don't mistake like if you reach out to someone and you don't hear from them, like that they don't care. They've probably been distracted and busy with other things. So be persistent.
Yes, sir.
Being from here, what is your perception of the progress that South Carolina has made? And then also, do you think that the Wolfpack can cover the spread? I guess
On the second question, yeah. On the second question, there's an emotional answer and then one that's probably the right answer. The right answer is I don't think so, but I hope so on the spread. In terms of the progress in South Carolina, this is my home state, and Google makes huge investments. I had like you guys may be able to see this. It's a couple of stats on like Google's investments in the state. Those specific stats aside, like Google invests very heavily in the state because of the talent that's here. And I think we have the talent. One of the things that we have to guard against is people like Danny taking our most talented people, transforming them, and then them leaving the state, like I did, right? Like how do we have? That may be in the cards, but how do we keep them? How do we keep that super talent that exists here in the state, and how do we recruit talent from other parts of the country and the world to South Carolina? And I think that infrastructure is here, and you've heard Danny's vision. I think like that vision and reaching out, scaling is going to help that. One thing that I see, and I from time to time when I come back, that worries me is this notion of, and I hear it in other markets as well, is the desire or seeming desire to want to replicate Silicon Valley. And every market that's tried to do that have failed at that. And that's not our thing in South Carolina. Like South Carolina has its own thing, and there are industries that thrive here in South Carolina that make sense for South Carolina. And if we're very focused on that, make our targeted investments in that, keep our talent focused on that and scale, I think the progress that we've already seen we'll just continue to see. But that's the one caution that I'm hearing from some of the conversations I've been having. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's great. Because you're right. I mean, we have our own identity and industry, and I think we can elevate local companies here by just being who we are.
Who we are.
And incorporating some technology that may not be Silicon Valley, but manufacturing focused, but still good technology and innovation. My other question would be for Danny, for folks in the room with young kids, the journey and how do you pursue that with your young kids to be a part of that program in South Carolina? How soon do you have to be thinking about that to get them involved and curious about that?
I think the question is how can we start younger?
Yeah.
And so we do offer a lot of camps and educational experiences across the state, but by no means can we do it on our own. When we opened up in 1988, we were the only school to teach at this high level. And what we also saw as a vision for our school and the mission was to increase STEM education across the state. And that has happened because there are great schools out there that many of your kids go to that have great STEM offerings. And so I think right now what we're trying to do is reach down a little bit lower and start to do what we're doing at the high level at a lower level that then, if that works, which it is working, would also help the elementary schools and middle schools also increase what they're doing. So if you have if you have a connection with a school that we can partner with, we can bring a camp to them.
That's great. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
one, I'm fascinated by your transition from an engineer to government relations. And can you talk a little bit about the thought process of dealing from a STEM background of ones and zeros, and it's either yes or no, to the rather squishy world of kind of that change of mindset that you've got, obviously, have to have?
Yeah, I'll tell you how I got into this. So in 2013, it feels squishy a lot too. I'll tell you. In 2013, Google had this harebrained idea of having like this brand new tech, but before we finished it, we would do a public beta. It was called Google Glass. I don't know whether you guys remember this thing. You know, inside the walls of Google, that sounds like a great idea. Public beta, we'll get feedback. But what we didn't anticipate was that part of that feedback loop is civil society and governments and people who are like, I don't want people in my town walking around with a supercomputer on their face. Like that, people are concerned about privacy and safety and security. And we didn't anticipate that. But we had all this incoming from governments around the world, even though the public beta was just in the US and just 1,000 devices. But we're getting this feedback from all over the world. So they created a role for someone to like do something about these policy issues. And that's what it was like, that sounds interesting. It sounds like a big challenge. So that's why I put my name in the hat and got it. And so that's where it started. But it was a blank canvas role. It didn't exist before. So I had to define what this would look like. And the way I didn't come from a political background or a policy background. I'm an engineer. I'm a technologist and a lawyer, a litigator. So part of how I defined that was, this is going to be a two-part thing. One is going to be helping our internal technical people understand how this stuff plays out in the world, right? Because they don't speak that language. They're building they think it's cool to have a camera facing on society doesn't really think that's that cool. So help them to understand this. And then on the flip side of that, help policymakers understand technology and the technology development process and like where this is going. One of the things that policymakers didn't understand was one of the cool things about Google Glass was that it used bone conduction technology. So you can actually hear without having a headphone on or a thingy in your ear. It was bone. It was like vibrations against this bone here. And that technology now is being like furthered. It's helping people who have like hearing impairments, et cetera. And so I went out around the world and was explaining the tech to policymakers who aren't technologists. They're not reading the Silicon Valley Journal and why this is all cool. Like they're trying to make sure that we're not harming their constituents. So that's the world that I'm in now, is this translation function that really does have technology at its foundation. And so it hasn't been as stark a transition as it may seem when you hear government affairs. What I do in government affairs is not the traditional lobbying or like the political aspects of it. It's more about this translation function. Yeah, that's helpful. All right, Sharice, thank you so much for giving me time to meet with you guys.